Respirator protection. The session objectives are going to be to identify the hazards of airborne contaminants, identify and use appropriate respiratory protection, recognize the limitations and capabilities of respirators, be sure you know how to inspect, maintain, and store your respirators, how to use respirators under dangerous or emergency conditions, understand procedures for medical evaluations, and recognize the medical signs and symptoms that may prevent effective respirator use. Respirator use locations. There are some places where respirators can be used and some places where respirators cannot be used. And we're going to also learn about the types of airborne contaminants that respirators can effectively mitigate. Inhalation hazards. You have airborne particulates, which are things like dust, fog, smoke, fumes, mist, and aerosols. You have chemical vapors or gases. You have biological organisms, things like bacteria, mold, spores, fungi, and viruses. And you also have situations where there is a lack of oxygen in an environment where a respirator is necessary. There's something known as IDLH, which means it's immediate dangerous to life or health. It is a term that is used to describe a situation like an oxygen deficient environment. It can occur in confined spaces or during large chemical spills or chemical fires. It's protect with you have to have like a full face air supplied respirator, SAR, with self-contained air to be in any of these environments, and you have to have a standby person trained in emergency rescue if you're going to work in any kind of immediately dangerous to life and health atmosphere. How respirators work. They prevent the inhalation of airborne contaminants. They generate negative pressure and positive pressure in the respirator, and air is designed to pass through a filter and then be absorbed by a catalyst or some type of material which traps the contaminants. When are respirators needed? Well, they're needed when other controls are inadequate or not feasible. You don't ever want to rely on a respirator if there are other methods for providing protection, such as really good ventilation or other engineering controls that can really take the hazard away. Sometimes they're needed during the installation of engineering controls, or during maintenance for an operation, or while performing non-routine tasks that aren't performed on a regular basis. And of course, are often required during emergency response procedures. Different types of respirators. We have, they're usually tight-fitting, ones with straps, clamps, half face, full face, mouthpiece. You also have just the dust mask, which are sometimes more durable and sometimes just for single use. You also have loose fitting, which are like for hood or helmets. Respirators are assigned a protection factor. It's called the APF. It's the minimum level of protection of a properly functioning respirator. The APF number means the airborne contaminant filtered by the respirator that you may inhale, and each type of respirator must have an APF for the contaminant it filters. You have air purifying respirators. They work on negative pressure. They simply filter the air. They are not for oxygen deficient environments. They're good for particulates, gas and vapors, a combination of those, and they're limited to non-IDLH atmospheres. And most of them have an APF of 50 or less. You have the half-face APR. It's got a maximum APR of 10. There's no protection for the face or eyes, sight's not impaired, and it's not as heavy as a full-face respirator. You have the full-face respirator. It's got a maximum APF of 50, protects the face and eyes, it's difficult to see, it's difficult to speak, and if you have vision problems, it's going to require lens correction. And then you have the air purified respirator, or the powered air purified respirator. These have a maximum APF of 25 to 1000. Basically, a blower forces ambient air through a filter and keeps positive pressure in the mask or in your respirator. The reason these have a higher APF than just a regular respirator is that it provides that positive pressure so that you have zero opportunity when you pull in air for it to be pulled around the mask. Most respirators that are not air supplied, when you pull in, it sucks up against your face, and you have some small amount of air that is not going through the filter that's pulling into the mask. Prohibited uses of APR and PAPR respirators, of course, IDLH atmospheres, unknown air contaminants. If you don't know what it is, you can't pick a respirator because you won't know what the protection factors are going to be. Contaminants with poorly understood exposure limits or warnings. Some chemicals are just flat out, there is no respirator that will work for them. And contaminant concentrations that exceed the MUC limits. And the MUC limits are basically the OSHA permissible exposure limits, or the PELs, times the APF for the respirator. You multiply those two units together to get the MUC, which is a number which OSHA publishes as what's acceptable to expose people to. You also have atmosphere supplying respirators. These provide a separate self-contained air supply outside of your ambient air. SAR or SCBA, scuba, you're going to have an air tank with this. Sometimes the rebreather actually takes your air, cleans it up, and then gives it back to you. But this allows you to have really, really high levels of protection when you're working in IDLH atmospheres. And it's got a protection factor of 10,000. This is for superhazardous chemicals and environments. You also have the dust mask, which basically just works on negative pressure. It filters large pieces of particles. The hazard protection factor is very limited, and there's really no protection factor assigned. Very limited amounts of protection available with just a dust mask. You also have units that are designed just for escape only. These are intended only for emergency exit, used to maintain, usually in IDLH atmospheres where you're using some kind of other air supplied respirator, and if it should fail, you need this as a backup to escape safely. Respirator selection. You have the physical state of the contaminants you have to consider. The contaminant concentrations have to be considered. Is it an oxygen deficient environment? Warning properties of the contaminants. Potential for IDLH atmosphere, and the length of time of use for the respirator. How long are you going to use it? The workload of the wearer is also critical. Respirators tend to create fatigue because you're having to work harder to breathe in. The working environment, the temperature should also be considered. The proper filter media for a given contaminant. Not all contaminants can be filtered with the same cartridges. Potential hazard of skin contact with the contaminants, and also the potential hazard for eye contact will determine whether you need a full face respirator or not. Respirators for non-IDLH use. If cartridges have a no end of service life indicator, a change schedule must be used. Some cartridges, as you use them, there will be a tab or a spot that will change color, indicating that it is no longer working. Not all respirator cartridges have an end of service life indicator. And then also you have an added table for oxygen deficient atmosphere based on the altitude. You have filters, cartridges, and canisters. All must be labeled and color-coded with a NIOSH approved label. NIOSH is the organization which basically gives oversight for respirators and those types of issues. The label must not be removed, and it must remain legible. It must be marked with the NIOSH manufacturer's name and part number, and the cartridge or filter type, the matrix approval label supplied, and an end of service license and indicator must be a NIOSH certified for APRs. Respirator filter color codes. All of the filters that go on respirators are standardized with different color code to indicate what they are acceptable for filtering. If you have acid gases such as sulfuric acid, you would use a white colored respirator filter. For acid gases and organic vapors, a yellow. For acid, ammonia, and organic vapors, brown. For acid gas, ammonia, carbon monoxide, and organic vapors, red. Ammonia, you need a green one. Carbon monoxide, blue. Chlorine, white and yellow. Dust, fumes, and mist that are non-radioactive, orange. Organic vapor, black. And other gases and vapors, you would use the olive-colored respirator filter. All respirators must be fit tested to be sure that they are fitting to the face very tightly. It ensures that no contaminants leak into the face piece around the filter medium. It's required to do your fit test annually or after weight loss and dental work, and you cannot do a fit test or use a respirator if you have a beard. A mustache is allowable, but not a beard. A beard will prevent a good seal against the face and basically renders the respirator ineffective. There are qualitative tests, fit tests, which basically look at the negative pressure, exposures of less than 10 times permissible limit. So as long as your respirator does not need to reduce your exposure by more than 10 times for what you're being exposed to, you can use a qualitative fit test. Okay, and these are subjective. They basically are based on smell or taste of an irritant, smoke, or some type of ambient aerosol which is sprayed around you in the test environment while you breathe through the respirator to determine if you can detect either the taste or the smell of the product that's being exposed to you. There are also quantitative fit tests, and these are required anytime your exposure limits are 10 times the occupational acceptable limit. So if you're being exposed to things that are at a rate of 10 times what is acceptable for you to be exposed to, you must use a quantitative fit test. These can be performed by experts in this area. Typically, companies will implement engineering controls to get the environment below 10 times the occupational limit before they ever consider going with these types of systems. The seal check, basically you can have no facial hair or glasses when you're using like a full face respirator. The face piece must be pushed up and sealed against the face, and you perform the seal check each time you put on your respirator to make sure it's not damaged, that you can feel it pull up against your face when you pull air through it. And you want to do it both ways with a positive and negative pressure. You suck in hard, breathe in hard, make sure it pulls up against your face. While holding it against your face, you blow out and make sure that the air is coming out through the exhaust. There are voluntary use programs for respirators, and these are primarily for dust filters and dust masks. You do not have to have a program if you're just using a dust mask, but you do need to inform people of the importance of using clean ones, throwing them away after use, and things like that. You always want to inspect your respirator carefully each time you use it. If you're using emergency respirators, you want to check them at least monthly when they're not in use, and check before and after each use. You want to check the elastic parts for pliability, deterioration, and report any problems or defects you find with your respirator. You need to toss out old dust masks. You need to remove filters. You need to wash, rinse, and clean your respirator when you're done with it. You need to dry it off with a dry cloth, and you need to reassemble it and test it. You always want to wash your respirator and clean it up with approved chemicals. Never use solvents or things like that that can deteriorate the rubber and the seals for the respirator. You always want to store it in a bag in a clean, dry place where it's not going to be exposed to sunlight or contaminants. Sunlight can break down rubbers and greatly reduce their life. and you don't want to allow the face piece to ever be distorted, so you wouldn't want to store it someplace where it was being mashed or heavy objects put on top of it. Every year it's required that you have a medical evaluation, and this involves a questionnaire, a spirometer test to make sure that you have the lung capacity and that you're healthy enough to be using it. This must be done by a physician, and there must be a follow-up evaluation if conditions or your health changes. The regulatory requirements for respirator use is that it requires your company to have a written respiratory protection plan, which we have. It requires employee training, annual medical evaluation, an annual fit test, and to provide respirators at no cost to the employees. Employers' general requirements are to use NIOSH approved respirators only, evaluate the workplace for hazards, select respirators from multiple models and sizes to be sure that they adequately fit and meet the needs for your people, and where exposures to hazards can't be estimated, consider it as IDLH atmospheres and do not allow people to use respirators when working there. The written respiratory protection plan includes written procedures for respiratory selection, use, training, and fitting, respiratory maintenance, storage, inspection, and work area surveillance. It includes medical examinations and program evaluation. Additional plan requirements must be site-specific, and you must have a program administrator. What's wrong with this atmosphere right here where this gentleman is working? As you can see, he's applying trichloroethane in a confined space. He has a half-face respirator. He becomes unconscious. There are so many things, so many hazards that are here. He shouldn't have been in this confined space working at all with any kind of respirator other than possibly a scuba unit. If it was a confined space, there should have been a rescue person outside trained in rescue. He should have probably should have been some engineering controls as far as additional ventilation being blown down into here to prevent the fumes from building up. There's all kinds of things that could have and should have been done there. But in the end, you have to understand the chemicals you're working with. You have to understand the type of respirator you have, what its limitations are, and you have to ensure that engineering controls have been implemented to reduce the exposure to at least 10 times what the permissible limits are before even considering using a respirator. Key points to remember: understand the physical and health hazards of the dangerous airborne substances that you work with. Read the MSDS sheets. Know what you're working with. Make sure appropriate engineering controls are implemented before using a respirator. That would include things such as ventilation and other issues like that that would lower your exposure limits. Know how to properly don, fit, use, inspect, clean, and store your respirator. Inspect respirator cartridges before each use, and always make sure the right respirator and cartridge are matched for the appropriate working conditions and contaminants. Remember, not all cartridges perform and meet any kind of requirements for lowering the exposure limits. It depends on cartridges must be matched with the specific chemicals and contaminants for which you're being exposed to. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Applied Risk Solutions. Thank you.